This is not the horror of ghosts, nor the terror of monsters. It is far darker. Friedrich Nietzsche once warned that when the old gods die, the human soul is left alone. In a cold, endless night, stripped of meaning, haunted by freedom, we face the abyss. But the abyss does not stay silent. It whispers back, it stares back, and it devours. Tonight we enter Nietzsche's nightmare, a horror story not of the supernatural, but of the soul itself. When Nietzsche declared that God is dead, it was not a triumphant shout of victory over religion, but a chilling observation about the condition of the modern soul. For centuries, human beings lived under the light of God, with faith as the torch that guided morality, gave structure to life, and provided ultimate meaning. That divine presence, whether accepted with devotion or feared with trembling, was an anchor for the human spirit. But in Nietzsche's time, he saw that this anchor had begun to crumble. Science, rationalism, and the dissection of old traditions had stripped away the certainty of belief. What remained was a world no longer illuminated, a world plunged into darkness. This is the beginning of the nightmare, not the death of a deity in some faraway heaven, but the collapse of meaning here on earth. Imagine a society that once saw every act, every law, every punishment, and every virtue as flowing from divine authority. With the death of that authority, these values no longer carry the same weight. They are revealed as human inventions, fragile and uncertain. Suddenly, morality is not eternal but contingent. Purpose is not given but must be made. This realization does not come gently. It arrives like a thunderclap, tearing through the soul with the terror of freedom. Without God, the light that once revealed the path forward has gone out, and humanity stumbles in the dark, unsure of what is right, what is true, what is worth living for. The horror is not that God was killed by some force, but that humanity itself outgrew him, and now must face the silence that follows. Nietzsche's parable of the madman captures this descent into darkness. A man runs through the marketplace crying, "Where has God gone? We have killed him, you and I." The crowd laughs because they do not yet understand the weight of his words. But the madman presses on, asking how humanity will cope with such an enormous loss. Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the horizon? What did we do when we unchained the earth from the sun? Without the old foundation, existence begins to drift in infinite space with no up or down, no center, no certainty. The imagery is cosmic, but the terror it points to is profoundly personal. When the old light goes out, the soul is left to wander in endless night, surrounded not by demons or beasts, but by the suffocating emptiness of its own freedom. For Nietzsche, this is not merely a cultural event, but a psychological horror story. To live without God is not simply to change beliefs, but to feel the ground tremble beneath your feet. If there is no divine order, then nothing guarantees that life has meaning. The rituals, traditions, and moral codes that once seemed sacred now reveal themselves as masks. And when the mask falls, the soul sees itself reflected in the void. That reflection is terrifying because it demands responsibility. If there is no higher power, then the weight of creating meaning falls on human shoulders alone. No savior will come, no cosmic justice will balance the scales. You must give shape to your own existence or be swallowed by despair. This is why Nietzsche's words still echo like a nightmare. The death of God is not liberation alone. It is disorientation, dread, and darkness. It is waking up in a universe where the sun has gone out, where the stars are extinguished, and where the soul realizes it must carry its own torch. But what if that torch fails? What if the individual cannot bear the burden of creating meaning? Then the nightmare deepens, and the human soul drifts, lost in the cold abyss of freedom. Nietzsche's warning about the abyss is perhaps one of his most haunting images. He wrote, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into the abyss also gazes into you." At first glance, this may seem like a poetic metaphor, but its meaning cuts far deeper. To confront evil, chaos, or meaninglessness is not a passive act. It changes the one who dares to look. The abyss is not merely an external void, but something within the human soul itself, a reflection of the darkest truths about existence and the fragile line between order and destruction. It is the silent mirror of the soul that returns not comfort, but horror. The abyss can be thought of as the ultimate emptiness, the absence of meaning, the yawning pit that opens up once the illusions of religion, morality, or tradition have been stripped away. To gaze into it is to face reality without the protective shield of comforting lies. Most people avert their eyes, preferring to live inside illusions because the raw truth is unbearable. Nietzsche, however, insisted that courage requires us to look directly into that nothingness, to see life for what it is. Yet here lies the danger. When you stare too long, when you immerse yourself in the void, it begins to transform you. The terror of the abyss is not simply that it is there, but that it is alive, watchful, and capable of reshaping the human spirit. Consider a person who dedicates their life to battling corruption, evil, or cruelty. At first, their aim is noble, to rid the world of monsters. But in order to defeat those monsters, they must study them, understand them, even imitate their strategies. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boundary between the fighter and the monster begins to blur. Hatred becomes fuel, violence becomes a tool, suspicion becomes a habit. One day the person looks in the mirror and finds that the monster is no longer outside but within. This is the abyss gazing back. It has crept into the soul, shaping thoughts, desires, and actions, until what once was resisted has now become part of the self. The abyss is not always about confronting external evil. It is also about the inner void. When a person peers into the meaningless depths of life, into the terrifying possibility that there is no inherent purpose, the abyss stares back by whispering despair. It tempts with nihilism, the belief that nothing matters and nothing is worth striving for. To stare into this abyss for too long can drain the will to live, suffocating the spirit with a sense of futility. The soul that once sought truth and courage risks falling into paralysis, where every action feels empty, every effort pointless. In this way, the abyss is not only a philosophical challenge, but a psychological trap. And yet Nietzsche did not issue this warning merely to terrify. The abyss is both a danger and a test. It reveals whether a person has the strength to resist becoming what they fight, and whether they can endure the silence of nothingness without being swallowed by it. The danger is always present because the abyss is relentless. It has no mercy, no voice, no boundaries. It is infinite, and once the soul locks eyes with it, the struggle begins. The one who stares must either rise above the void, forging strength and values from within, or sink into it, becoming its reflection. The thought of eternal recurrence is one of Nietzsche's most unsettling and imaginative challenges, a philosophical horror that presses directly against the core of human existence. Imagine being told that every moment of your life, every choice you make, every failure, every humiliation, every fleeting joy will return again and again, endlessly, in an infinite cycle. There will be no escape, no final rest, no redemption through a higher world. You will live the same life, with the same details, repeating eternally. This is not a metaphor for reincarnation, nor a promise of future reward, but a test of the soul's strength. It is a mirror held to human existence, asking whether we can affirm our lives so fully that we would welcome their eternal return. The first reaction to this thought is horror. Who would want to relive every mistake, every heartbreak, every loss? To think of an embarrassing moment, a deep regret, or the anguish of grief, and then imagine it repeating endlessly is enough to make the soul recoil. Most people hope that life, with all its pain, is a temporary passage, that suffering has an end or a purpose. But eternal recurrence denies both. Suffering does not end, it cycles. There is no hidden purpose. The only meaning is the one you give. In this sense, Nietzsche's thought experiment becomes a nightmare, a prison of time where the walls close in and there is no door leading out. It is the horror of being trapped not by an external power but by one's own life. Yet Nietzsche did not frame this idea simply to torture the imagination. Eternal recurrence is a test of affirmation. He asks, if you were confronted by a demon who whispered this truth to you, how would you respond? Would you collapse in despair, cursing your existence, or would you embrace the thought, declaring that you love your life so completely that you would gladly relive it forever? The abyss of recurrence demands that you face your life honestly, without illusions. It exposes every compromise, every avoidance, every cowardice, because these are the moments that would torment you if lived again and again. At the same time, it asks whether you can cultivate such strength of spirit that even suffering becomes part of a larger affirmation. Even pain becomes something to embrace as necessary. To live as though eternal recurrence were true is to live with radical responsibility. Every choice is magnified, every moment eternalized. You cannot console yourself by saying this is temporary, or that you will do better in some afterlife, or that your mistakes will be erased. There is no escape. There is only the endless return of what you choose now. This thought forces you to confront your own existence with a seriousness that feels almost unbearable. It strips away excuses and forces you to consider whether your life as it is something you can truly love. If not, then the challenge is to change it, to shape it into something worthy of repetition. The nightmare of eternal recurrence is that it removes all illusions of progress, finality, or salvation. The dream of an ultimate resolution, a place where suffering ends, is shattered. Instead, the soul faces the possibility that this is all there is, and that it will return forever. But hidden within this terror is also a demand for greatness. If one can say yes to recurrence, if one can affirm life with such power that even its darkest hours are embraced, then one has overcome despair. Eternal recurrence is both a curse and a curse for those who shrink from life, a call to those who would rise to the challenge of loving their fate completely. Nietzsche's life and thought are inseparable when it comes to the theme of madness and truth. He was a philosopher who pushed further than most into the raw edges of existence, tearing away the comforting layers of illusion that shield ordinary minds from despair. For him, truth was not a gentle illumination, but a blazing light that could blind. He rejected the consolations of religion, the moral codes inherited from tradition, and the soft promises of progress. What remained was a vision of the world stripped bare, chaotic, indifferent, and without inherent meaning. To face such a vision requires immense strength, because truth, in Nietzsche's sense, is not abstract knowledge, but the confrontation with the abyss beneath human life. Madness lurks in this confrontation, where the soul risks being shattered by the weight of what it sees. The line between genius and madness has always been fragile, and Nietzsche walked it more dangerously than most. His aphorisms are filled with warnings about how the search for truth can consume the seeker. To recognize that all values are human creations, that morality is not divine command but human fabrication, that meaning itself is not found but made, is to stare into a void that most minds are not prepared to endure. The collapse of God was not simply a cultural shift but an existential earthquake, shaking the foundations of thought and identity. Nietzsche saw this collapse more clearly than others, and he bore it in isolation. The loneliness of his vision, the intensity of his insight, became a burden heavy enough to crack his own sanity. His eventual mental breakdown in 1889, when he collapsed in Turin after reportedly throwing his arms around a beaten horse, has become almost mythic in retellings of his life. In the years that followed, he descended into silence, cared for by his mother and later his sister, until his death. For many, this descent is inseparable from his philosophy. The man who dared to see too much, who unveiled too many illusions, was consumed by the very truths he uncovered. Whether his madness was the result of illness, genetics, or the strain of his intellectual journey is still debated. But symbolically it represents the risk he himself described, the risk that the pursuit of truth can destroy. When you strip away every comforting lie, what remains may be unbearable. Madness, in this sense, is not only a medical condition, but a metaphor for the human inability to withstand ultimate truths. Most people live inside protective illusions, clinging to stories, rituals, and values that soften the harshness of existence. Nietzsche saw these as lies, but also as necessary for most people. To remove them is to leave the soul naked before reality, a condition so raw it borders on insanity. The philosopher, then, is both courageous and tragic. Courageous for daring to uncover what others will not, tragic for risking the collapse that may follow. In Nietzsche's own life, this tragedy became real. His writings whisper of truths too sharp to hold safely, truths that burned even the one who carried them. Yet Nietzsche did not entirely despair. His call was not simply to expose the illusions, but to overcome them, to create values anew, to transform the unbearable truth into something affirmable. But this demand is extreme, requiring a strength that few possess. To see clearly and still affirm life is to walk on the edge of madness and remain standing. Nietzsche's fate reminds us of the cost of such clarity. His vision of truth was so intense, so merciless, that it consumed the man who bore it. It leaves us with a haunting question. How much truth can a soul endure before it breaks? The figure of Thuber, or Overman, is perhaps Nietzsche's most famous and most misunderstood idea. It is often painted as a savior figure, a being who transcends the limitations of ordinary humanity. But Nietzsche's vision was more unsettling than hopeful. Thuber is not simply a higher being who arrives to deliver humanity, but the product of struggle, self-overcoming, and the destruction of illusions. It emerges when old values collapse and new ones must be created, when the individual no longer relies on religion, tradition, or herd morality to guide them. But within this vision lies a deep ambiguity, one that can quickly turn from dream to nightmare. Thuber can be seen as a liberator, but it can also appear as a monster, unchained from morality, driven by the will to power, and capable of reshaping the world without restraint. The horror of Thuber lies in its double edge. On one hand, it embodies the courage to create meaning in a world where God is dead, where the old foundations no longer hold. This creation requires strength, vision, and the ability to affirm life, even in the face of suffering. Thuberus, the one who loves fate, who embraces eternal recurrence, who does not shrink from the abyss, but uses it as a forge to shape new values. On the other hand, once freed from the chains of traditional morality, nothing guarantees that the values created will be life-affirming. Freedom from all restraints can become a form of tyranny. A being that rises beyond good and evil may create a new world of beauty and strength, but it may also impose domination, cruelty, and destruction, all justified by the power to do so. This is the darker side of Nietzsche's vision, the nightmare hidden within the dream. If Thuber is a model for human greatness, then the question arises: greatness according to whom? Without universal standards, without divine law, the greatness of one individual may mean the suffering of countless others. The will to power that Nietzsche saw as the fundamental drive of life can express itself in creation and growth, but also in conquest and subjugation. Thuber, in its monstrous form, is the figure who looks down at humanity not as equals to be uplifted, but as clay to be molded, or as obstacles to be crushed. In this way, the dream of surpassing humanity can dissolve into a nightmare of domination, where the strong write their values in the suffering of the weak. Nietzsche's writings deliberately avoid defining Thuber in detail, leaving it open as an aspiration rather than a fixed image. But this ambiguity is part of what makes it so unsettling. It represents a future beyond humanity, but not necessarily a better one. It demands the courage to break away from the herd, but in doing so it risks producing figures who are not saviors, but predators. Thuber is the one who dares to affirm life without illusions. But if that affirmation takes the form of cruelty or indifference, then the human soul finds itself confronted not with salvation, but with monstrosity. The horror lies in the realization that the path to greatness may also be the path to dehumanization. Thuber, then, is not a comforting dream but a challenge, one that forces us to ask whether we are strong enough to create values that uplift life rather than degrade it. It is the possibility of a higher type of human, but also the possibility of a figure who embodies freedom without compassion, power without limits. To dream of becoming more than human is also to risk becoming less than humane. Nietzsche's nightmare is that in reaching beyond ourselves, in trying to break the old chains, we may unleash a monster disguised as a savior. The soul that seeks transcendence must therefore tread carefully, for the border between creation and destruction, between savior and monster, is perilously thin. Most people are not ready to face the raw truths that Nietzsche revealed, and so they turn instead to the comfort of illusions. These illusions are not accidental but deeply woven into the fabric of human life. Religion offers stories of divine order and eternal justice, soothing the fear that life is meaningless. Morality, as inherited from tradition, promises a clear map of right and wrong, sparing the individual from the anxiety of choice. Conformity to the herd assures belonging, safety, and the reassurance that one does not stand alone in the abyss. These comforts act as chains, invisible but heavy, binding the soul to a life of half-awareness. Nietzsche called them lies because they deny the terrifying freedom of existence, yet they are lies willingly chosen because they ease the weight of responsibility. The herd instinct is perhaps the strongest of these chains. To live as others live, to believe what others believe, to value what others value, provides a sense of stability. The individual feels shielded by the collective, relieved of the burden of thinking and deciding for themselves. But in this safety lies stagnation. The herd resists the new, resents the exceptional, and clings to the familiar even when it is suffocating. To break free from the herd is to step into isolation, to risk mockery, rejection, and loneliness. Most people lack the strength to bear that cost, so they remain bound, telling themselves that obedience is virtue and conformity is truth. The horror from Nietzsche's perspective is that these chains are chosen freely. People prefer the comfort of lies to the terror of freedom. Religion, too, plays its part in this great deception. By promising another world, a higher reality where suffering will be redeemed and justice will prevail, it diverts attention from the only life we truly possess. Instead of affirming this life, with all its pain and struggle, the believer clings to the hope of another. This hope is comforting but comes at a cost. It devalues the present, teaching people to endure misery rather than transform it. Nietzsche saw this as a sickness of the soul, a refusal to embrace life as it is, yet he also understood its appeal. To believe that one's suffering has a purpose, that one's life is guided by divine meaning, is far easier than to confront the possibility that life is indifferent and that meaning must be created by human hands alone. The chains of comfort also take the form of morality. When morality is inherited rather than created, it becomes a shield against responsibility. People tell themselves they are good because they follow rules written long before them, because they obey commandments instead of forging their own path. This obedience feels safe because it absolves them of guilt for making their own choices. But Nietzsche warned that such morality is life-denying, a refusal to affirm one's own instincts, desires, and strength. It keeps the individual small, fearful, and dependent, unable to rise beyond the mediocrity of the herd. The lie of comfort whispers that submission is noble, when in truth it is often cowardice disguised as virtue. The nightmare hidden in these comforts is that they prevent the human soul from becoming what it could be. They smother the will to power, the drive to create, and replace it with passivity. A life lived in chains may feel secure, but it is a ghost of a life, lacking the intensity and affirmation that Nietzsche demanded. Yet the majority cling to it willingly, afraid of what freedom might expose. The horror is not imposed from outside, but chosen from within, a silent pact to remain asleep rather than awaken. Nietzsche's vision forces the question, is it better to live shackled by comforting lies, or to risk everything for the frightening possibility of genuine freedom? Nietzsche's nightmare is not a tale of ghosts or demons. It is the horror of the human soul laid bare. It is the terror of a world where God is dead, where the abyss waits for those who dare to look, where time itself may be a curse of eternal return. It is the madness of truth, the monstrous ambiguity of the Uber, and the suffocating chains of the herd. What he revealed is not a philosophy of comfort, but a mirror of dread, a reminder that freedom is not safety, and truth is not peace. The nightmare is ours to face, to either remain asleep in the comfort of lies, or to awaken and risk everything for the chance to create meaning in the void. The choice is terrible, but it is the only one the human soul has.